There's one other aspect of indexes that we need to talk about that can tend to confuse you if you read the Microsoft description of this concept of clustered or non-clustered indexes. And as a matter of fact, not just Microsoft, but a lot of people's descriptions of these just tends to get too academic and it confuses you. So I'm going to simple it and boil it down here. When you create an index on a table in SQL Server, you've got a choice of building a clustered index or a non-clustered index. And so let's kind of break these down and go through them. First of all, a clustered index simply means that the data in that table is going to be physically stored in the order of the clustered index, which means logically that there can only be one clustered index per table. Let that sink in. This is usually the primary key. Now we generally think of creating a primary key and it becomes a clustered index. Doesn't have to be. We'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes here. Here's another thing to think about. If I don't have a clustered index, then my table is being stored in no particular order. Now let me draw a pitiful little diagram for you here. So here's a table and I'm putting my data in here, and if there is a clustered index, then some of the times when I put data in, it may actually insert a line between some other ones because it's putting it in based on my cluster. Say it's based on the last name, and this last name for this new line belongs right here. So it has to go find the appropriate location, and in doing so, it may have to spread the data out on more data pages and so forth. But that clustered index can make it very easy to search through the data because I know what particular order the data is in. Let's back up just a second though and think about a heap. If I don't have a clustered index, and I'm basically saying, look, I'm not telling you how to store the data in this table. Store it however you want to. What I'm really saying is store it as it comes in, which means no matter what you put in there in the database, it's always just going to go to the next available data page location, and the data basically always goes on the end of all the other data. But it's not in any particular order. Now think about this from a database development design standpoint. If I want a table that I can put data into really quickly, then don't put a clustered index on it. Leave it as a heap. It'll always just write the data right on the very end. Now querying this table is going to be somewhat of a challenge because every query is going to have to read every row. So for that reason, a lot of times our staging tables on data warehouses will be non-clustered index tables, or they'll be heaps. Let's move on to non-clustered indexes. I can have one clustered index and it determines the physical order of my data storage. Non-clustered indexes simply create indexes, but they don't affect the order in which the data is stored. In other words, it's just kind of a what-if column. It's like, you know what, it's really clustered on the last name, but I want to do a non-clustered on the phone number because we do a lot of queries based on the phone number, and it will put the phone numbers in order. It will give us kind of a virtual view of this table if it had been put in a phone number order. Now, a non-clustered index, by the way, is the default. If I create an index and don't mention what kind to create it, it will create a cluster. If I already have a cluster, it'll throw an error and say you already have a cluster, but you can't have but one because we can't store it in but one order. Now, this is something that's kind of new from previous versions. Previous versions of SQL Server, you could have up to 249 non-clustered indexes. You can now have up to 999 non-clustered indexes per table, which means you can really hurt yourself. If you have 999 indexes on a table, can you imagine how long it's going to take to update that table? Because all of those indexes have to be maintained, and also the table's going to take up a lot more space and all that. So when you're designing a database and you're designing the tables, you're going to have to decide where's my clustered index. And then for most of us, most of the time in the real world, when you're creating indexes on tables and data, you're probably creating non-clustered indexes. These are just other indexes that don't actually affect the physical storage of the table. Now, if you want to read more on this, go out to Microsoft's site and just do some searches on clustered, non-clustered, and go out there and dig around on Google and stuff, because really, I'll just kind of give you a little hint, a little teaser, a nerd teaser, by the way, if you will, that what we're really talking about with clustered and non-clustered is how the data is actually stored at the leaf level in the structure of the database itself. And so I'll just kind of leave that with you. If that sounds exciting to you, go read about it. Otherwise, you might want to avoid it. But that's clustered and non-clustered indexes. And so anytime we talk about indexes, you're going to have to choose which one of these you want to create. Most of the time, the clustered is going to be your primary key, and everything else is going to be non-clustered.